Today I want to talk to you about something that's been on my mind, and that is a propensity that people have sometimes to jump out of a ditch and jump so hard and so far that they land in another ditch. Contextually, of course, I'm talking about religion, and I'm talking about really the exodus from Christianity. How many of us went to church? How many of us were God-fearing, Jesus-worshiping, pig-gobbling Christians, okay? I was. And what happened is, all of a sudden, I started pulling on that thread on my sweater, and I just kept pulling and pulling. Pretty soon, the whole thing came unraveled, and I realized, wow, you know what? I've been taught a bunch of stuff that just doesn't make any sense. It's not Bible. This is garbage. And, you know, I've started seeing the whole thing as this big sham. You know, I realized, hey, you know that thing Babylon it was talking about in the book of Revelation? I'm right here in the thick of it. This is what it is. It's talking about my churchianity. So I jumped and I ran and I went, you know, as far as I could to get away from that. But, you know, what they did and practiced and believed in the Bible, that set of laws, that set of commands, you know, that's a straight and narrow path. And Christianity is kind of a ditch off on the side of the road because, you know, instead of really doing what I'm supposed to be doing, I'm practicing a bunch of traditions and I'm teaching a bunch of man's doctrines. I've got a Bible, I carry it with me, I read it, but in reality, what I'm doing is taking human interpretations and I'm making those the actual word of my God, and I'm juxtaposing that onto the book, and I'm trying to read that meaning into the scriptures when in reality it's not there. So, you know, I'm not doing what my God said to do. I'm not on that straight and narrow path. If I'm practicing Christianity, I'm practicing the doctrines and traditions of men. Well, you know, I jumped out of that. But, you know, something that a lot of us do in the beginning, we say, I'm in the wrong religion. I've got to find the right religion. And so we dump one set of traditions and we run after another set of traditions. And, you know, that's exactly what I did. I said, I can't be a Christian anymore. So I must be a Jew. Okay, I need to look into Judaism. I need to see what that's all about because, you know, if you're reading the Old Testament of the Bible, you know, you're either one of two things today. You're either a Christian or you're a Jew. So I say, hey, I'm not a Christian, I must be a Jew. So I run in that direction, but, you know, I get there and I start looking, I say, wow, you know what, these guys believe in Torah. These guys believe in resting on the Sabbath. You know, these guys take it seriously, and they wear all these cool little hats. So, I mean, that must be the way to go. But then I start looking a little closer, and I start realizing, hey, you know, what's up with lighting 2 candles at Sabbath? I mean, where did that come from? Well, yeah, it's a tradition. Okay, seems harmless, not a big deal. You know, let's keep going. And, you know, the more I keep going and the more I keep looking, I start realizing, hey, you know, a lot of this practice and a lot of this religion, it's tradition as well. I left Christian tradition, but now I'm kind of getting into Jewish tradition. So what did I really do here? I abandoned the cross and I threw away my necklace that had a big cross on it. And now what am I doing? I'm out at the jewelry store and I'm buying another necklace that has a Star of David on it because, I mean, where was that Star of David in the Bible? You know, actually, the Star of Remphan's mentioned a couple of times and it's not a good thing. And when you look up what that Star of Remphan is, boy, it looks conspicuously like what's called the Star of David today. So, did I really just run from one idol to another? Well, you know, that's what I almost did. So where do I find myself today? Well, I'm striving to be on that straight and narrow path. and to stay out of the ditch, either ditch, on the left side of the road or the right side of the road. So, I'm not trying to adopt traditions. I'm not trying to follow men. I don't light 2 candles at Sabbath because, well, that's not Torah. That's not something that they did in the Bible. And likewise, I don't go to church on Sunday morning and worship a Trinity God because, that's not something they did in the Bible either. New Testament, Old Testament, I love them both. Basically, they say the exact same thing. Where a lot of people go wrong with this when they're on their path from Christianity to Judaism is that they have a newly found Judaic interpretation of the Old Testament. Because as a Christian, we were never taught the Old Testament. We were just read stories. Here's Noah and the ark. Here's Moses coming out of Egypt. We were never really taught the law and the faith and the religion and the covenant of the Old Testament. What we were taught were the stories. So when a lot of us really first started learning the Old Testament, it was with a Judaic interpretation. Well, what we had been taught in the churches was the New Testament, and that we were taught with a particularly pagan or Christian or Roman interpretation. Now, you've got these 2 parts of the book with 2 culturally very distinct interpretations. And of course, they don't jibe. They don't seem to say the same thing. A Judaic interpretation of the Old Testament versus a pagan Christian New Testament interpretation, man, those sound very contradictory. So what do? We say, well, I believe the Old Testament's true, and we accept that and we gravitate to that. And then we throw away the New Testament because our Christian interpretation of it suggests that it contradicts the Old Testament. What's bad here isn't the New Testament. What's bad here is the interpretation that we've been taught of it. So hopefully we get to that point eventually where we have left Christianity. We haven't fallen into rabbinical Judaism, but we are questioning everything. We are going back to the beginning and back to the basics and saying, okay, the beginning of knowledge is to admit that I know nothing. I know nothing. I need to start looking at this stuff from scratch. And then, let's take that same fresh, somewhat Judaic interpretation of the Old Testament. Let's apply that to the New Testament and try to erase all of the Christianity that's been imposed upon us. Now, if we look at it a little more closely, the Old Testament and the New Testament seem to say the same thing. Okay, that makes sense. But whenever we start reading the New Testament with those Christian glasses on, well, look, this is Paul teaching against the law. No, he wasn't. In fact, Peter even made a disclaimer about Paul's teaching, saying, hey, some of the things Paul says and writes, they're kind of hard to understand, especially if you don't have a solid education. And unlearned people that read his letters sometimes fall into the error of lawlessness. They get confused by what Paul's saying, and they think it means that we don't have law anymore, we don't have commandments anymore. So, we shouldn't be making that same mistake as unlearned people 2,000 years ago. When we read the New Testament, we have to understand Paul taught the law. They practiced the law. The law was very much in effect as it is today, as it was before. And when we interpret the New Testament within that understanding, with that as a framework, guess what? It doesn't contradict the Old Testament. You just have to read and understand what they're trying to say 2,000 years ago in another language, culturally removed from us today. And, again, getting past all of that dogma that we've all been taught. So we don't want to make the mistake of what I always say, throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We reject Messiah, we reject the New Testament, we reject the New Covenant, hey, what happened to all those prophecies in the Old Testament about all the things that happened in the New Testament? What happened to those prophecies about the Spirit being poured out, about the new covenant happening, about Messiah coming in a lowly form? What did we do with all these prophecies? Well, I don't know. I don't want to think that much about it. I just know that from what I've been taught about the New Testament, it seems to say different things than what I believe now, so I'm just going to ignore it and act like it doesn't exist. Throw the baby out with the bathwater. This is Messiah, and he's the king of Israel now, and I'm just going to ignore that guy and act like he doesn't exist. Who needs a high priest and who needs a king anyway? I'm just going to obey a bunch of commandments, and I'm pretty sure that's good enough. Well, okay, you know what? Who am I to say it isn't? But I'm definitely not going to be so haphazard and careless when I'm teaching my family and my house and anybody else who wants to learn. I'm not going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Rather than just discredit the whole New Testament and say, that doesn't make any sense. I want to read it a little bit more carefully with the understanding that I now have after knowing the Old Testament, and I'm going to see if it doesn't still make sense. And fact of the matter is, it very much does. But, that's the risk. Whenever we come out, when we don't study, when we don't give due diligence where it's needed, then, we start drawing some very imperfect conclusions based on imperfect information. When we discard a few words that Paul said, then we have to discard Peter because Peter vouched for Paul. And then when we discard Peter, we have to discard Yeshua because, he vouched for Peter. And without him, what's the point of the New Testament? So, we just wipe out all of those books and all of those letters all at once. And, if all we have now is the Old Testament, hey, isn't that what Karaite Judaism is? So, we've just basically become one form of Jew. And, if we dig a little deeper, and especially if we're watching our news feed on Facebook, pretty soon we start, hearing a little bit more and more rabbinical tradition. It starts making a little bit more sense to us. Pretty soon, here we are with the cute little hat on top of our head, lighting our 2 candles before Sabbath. And, when someone asks, do you keep Torah? We say, oh yeah, absolutely, sure. Even though in reality, we're doing some things Torah, a lot of things that aren't Torah. We really can't distinguish between the two. And this is something that even in Messiah's day, he dealt with. People would accuse him under rabbinical tradition. Hey, look at you. You're not supposed to pick food and eat it on the Sabbath day. I'm not. Who says? Well, look at your disciples. Those guys don't wash their hands before eating. No, why would they? There was this conflict between him walking that straight and narrow path and obeying Torah versus all the men around him who, in reality, were practicing a religion. They were practicing tradition. So, that's my warning. That's my precautionary tale for you. Please don't make that mistake. When you're coming out of tradition, don't jump into different tradition. When you're throwing away your cross, don't run and buy a Star of David to replace it, because in essence, that's what you're doing with your entire, religion. Don't replace bad with bad. Don't replace tradition with tradition. Ignore it all. Leave it all behind. This is what repentance is. Come back to what's actually written in your Bible. Old Testament, New Testament, obviously with emphasis being on the books of Moses, because that's where the Word of our God is contained. Focus on that. Let that be the foundation for all of the prophets and all of the apostles to come. But don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Don't leave tradition for more tradition. Don't trade one set of human spiritual leadership for another set of human spiritual leadership. Look for that straight and narrow path. Look for the teachings and doctrines, practices, and commands that you can find written and practiced in black and white in the Scriptures, Old and New Testament alike.